Hello. For those who don't know me, my name is Joe Langen. I'm a research fish biologist at NOAA GLERL, and I was asked to give a talk today on including climate information in fisheries management. A large part of my role at GLERL is to lead the Great Lakes implementation of the Climate Ecosystems and Fisheries Initiative, or CEFI. CEFI is a cross-NOAA effort to provide climate-informed advice for aquatic resource management, building on NOAA investments in research, modeling, and decision-making. So in short, this is an effort to take existing or under development data, model products, observations, etc., and better and more reliably deliver those to the decision makers that need them in the format they need them. Now, this initiative was developed largely for marine systems, where NOAA has a much different role in fisheries management. So in the Great Lakes, our objectives is a bit different. We're seeking to figure out how NOAA can best support the regional fisheries research and management framework with our environmental information from both observations and models. Now, one of the new investments NOAA is making under CEFI is further development of the Modular Ocean Model version 6 or MOM6 for each region of the country. What's really cool about MOM6 is it directly draws from the latest global climate models, making it easy and very tractable to use that latest climate information to make projections for your region or ecosystem of interest. Once we get this fully built up and validated in the Great Lakes, we'll be producing hindcasts, so modeling past conditions that can then be compared to observations from fishery surveys and things like that to identify important environmental relationships. And we'll also be doing forecasting at different timescales. There will be seasonal forecasts. So as we sit here in spring, we could think about what might this summer look like across the Great Lakes. There'll be interannual forecasts and kind of that 1 to 10 year time bin that might be relevant to management decision making in the near term. And of course, those classical climate projection multi-decadal forecasts out to say 2050 or 2100. Now, our model development team is hard at work and has been making really good progress, as shown in these figures at the right. Where on top, we have the modeled temperature from a model run of Lake Erie, and these bars represent observations from one of the temperature moorings, showing pretty good agreement overall. On the bottom, we have the MOM6 ice estimate for a given day in January on the top panel, and the observations in the bottom panel, showing again fairly good agreement between them. So we're very encouraged thus far by the progress that is being made. So you may be asking, particularly for fisheries where management strategies in the past have worked quite well, why might we want to change things or complicate them by introducing new environmental information? So to get at that, I'm going to provide a few examples of what climate-informed fisheries management can look like in marine systems, and then kind of bring that back to the Great Lakes and some of the activities CEFI is involved in. So I'm going to start with a fairly provocative example showing really this. If our ecosystems are experiencing new environmental conditions, it may be that those ecosystems start to exhibit new, unexpected, emergent behaviors that can present new challenges for fisheries management. A fairly dramatic example of that occurred in the Bering Sea. In 2018 and 2019, there was a substantial marine heat wave that reduced sea ice. Sea ice reduction resulted in a smaller Bering Sea cold pool. So, just like the ice in your drink, sea ice cools the surface ocean, making those waters more dense, such that they sink to the seafloor on the continental shelf and literally form kind of a pool of cold water. This is the Bering Sea cold pool. Now, this physical feature is very important for juvenile snow crab. They use it as a predation refuge, for one, where fish predators like walleye pollock or Pacific cod do not really like those cold temperatures. It also lowers their metabolism, so you can put a lot of crabs in a relatively small area, and ultimately they will require less prey. That is, unless there's a strong heat wave. So when this heat wave occurred, there was a substantially reduced cold pool and ultimately an unexpected population collapse of snow crabs, as can be seen in this figure on the right-hand side here, where note that this color scale comparing these two panels is on a log scale. Subsequent research has suggested that this population collapse was likely primarily due to starvation. where in a reduced cold pool where those waters are also warmer, crabs kind of piled together in the pockets of cold-ish water they could find. And between the warmer temperatures and the super high densities, or some mixture of those two factors, they ultimately may have not had enough prey and starved to death. That said, there were likely knock-on effects too from elevated predation and increased prevalence of a temperature-linked disease as well. Now, this is not to say that had managers been looking at the right climate model ecosystem projection, they necessarily would have anticipated this, not before seen dynamic before it happened. But now that we understand this potential relationship of physical changes in the Bering Sea on snow crab productivity and survival, we can then use climate models and ecosystem projections to help plan for the future, right? If we could estimate what the risk is that this may happen again in, say, the next 10 years, then managers may be able to think about how they may want to adjust their strategies, right? Perhaps being more conservative to hedge against substantial loss in a year class. They could also look at what the probability that is that this becomes a more frequent occurrence in, say, 30 or 50 years, and start to ask questions about how one then might want to start transitioning the fishery or diversifying the fishery to kind of soften that blow. So, while interesting, that example doesn't provide a direct, obvious, tangible management action, unlike this example. So, this is what I would call climate enhanced management. And this example focuses on yellowtail flounder off the East Coast, specifically the southern New England mid-Atlantic bite stock, so the stock unit south of Cape Cod. This is near the southern range limit for yellowtail flounder, and thus near the warm range limit. Now, yellowtail flounder recruitment or production of young fish has been shown to be enhanced by a strong mid-Atlantic bite cold pool. There's no sea ice in the mid-Atlantic bite, but sufficient wintertime cooling comes from vigorous mixing at the surface by wintertime storms to still produce generally the same kind of feature as you see in the Bering Sea. When yellowtail flounder juveniles are strongly associated with this cold pool, they seem to survive better. So, over the last 10 years or so, maybe a bit longer, fisheries managers had noticed or had found that stock assessment projections for the stock of yellowtail flounder had tended to be over optimistic, and specifically over optimistic in their recruitment projection. But they found then when they introduced an index of the cold pool directly into the stock assessment to help project recruitment that the performance improved. That is shown in this figure on the right, where this is the change in prediction error for recruitment using a metric known as Mohs rho. This first blue dot here represents a stock assessment model that include an observed index of the cold pool, and you see it's substantially reduced prediction error. What was interesting, though, is these researchers then found that modeled indices of the cold pool actually produced even better performance. And if you think about it, it makes sense, right? For those of you who've done field work, you know that it can be difficult to schedule. You could have vessel issues or weather disrupt your schedule. It's difficult to get samples over a large spatial area in a relatively short period of time, et cetera, et cetera. So in this case, actually using a modeled index of the cold pool provided kind of a more consistent measure of this feature. And in this case, improve the stock assessment further. Thus, in the future, managers could use projections from something like MOM6 to put that cold pool index directly into the recruitment function in the stock assessment, and thus be explicitly including climate information in how they develop the metrics on which they base fisheries advice. So that's a much cleaner example, but sometimes we don't have the information to do that kind of thing. This is an example of what I'd call climate-informed management that is based in part on my dissertation work. This is another New England flounder, this time winter flounder, again for the southern New England mid-Atlantic bite stock unit south of Cape Cod. The challenge with winter flounder is that they use estuaries for part of their life cycle. And as a result, the regional stock unit is really a mosaic of localized subpopulations that to some degree experience localized stressors that may differ across systems. As a result of that, at least historically, it has been difficult for researchers and managers to find a particular index of temperature or something like that that could be included in the stock assessment and made a substantial improvement in performance. And thus, it really hadn't, that type of information hadn't been included. Now, I should say this is an active area of research that is ongoing, so that may be changing or change in the near future, but that's what has been true historically. So, the concern about winter flounder started because there was a sharp decline in the stock biomass in the 1980s, as can be seen in this figure in the top right, where biomass is in blue. This decline came during a period of very high fishing mortality, here in red. So it's likely that overfishing caused this decline. But what was unexpected is when managers reduced fishing mortality over time, the stock failed to recover as expected. And that's due to what is shown here in the bottom panel. The recruits per spawning stock biomass, so how productive the stock was, dropped off at the same time that managers decreased fishing mortality. So in a sense, there weren't enough young flounder coming through the life cycle to really, for the population to really benefit from that reduction in harvest. So my research and research of others throughout the region concluded that there was a mortality bottleneck somewhere in the early life stages, and we collectively ultimately found it was likely due to multiple climate-linked and interacting stressors. So one could say then that the productivity of this stock is a function of climate change, and the climate has changed, therefore the productivity has changed. So what managers did in the meantime, in the absence of an explicitly climate dependent stock assessment model, is they just shortened the recruitment time series used in their stock assessment model. They said, okay, let's assume that due to this probable suite of different factors, that recruitment only in more recent years is reflective of the current stock productivity, and let's build our model off of that. So in that way now, the stock assessment was adapted to implicitly be based on climate information, based upon kind of more basic research, even if there wasn't a particular environmental index directly in the stock assessment model. Okay, that's enough of these marine systems. Let's jump to what Cefi is doing in the Great Lakes. I want to start by saying that NOAA in the Great Lakes has a lot of model products that I think can be highly valuable for fisheries research and management activities. As I mentioned, MOM6 is under development, but while that goes on, we have a model products in hand already that are quite valuable. This includes hydrodynamic 3D models of physical lake conditions in all lakes, hindcasted back multiple decades, producing that kind of data that one can use with observations from fishery surveys or the like to find important environmental relationships. For more restricted years, we also have biophysical models that include things like nutrients, chlorophyll, and zooplankton. And for those familiar with some of NOAA's activities in Lake Erie, you may have seen our hypoxia and harmful algal bloom forecasts as well. So the Cefi team in the Great Lakes is already putting those model products to work, trying to assist researchers and managers to include this kind of environmental information in their ongoing activities. Here are a few examples of where we were able to provide that kind of data and advice on how to use it. Ontario M&R reached out to us because they were looking to do distribution modeling for Lake Whitefish and Lake Ontario based upon telemetry data, but they lacked the temperature data they wanted to use for their distribution model. So we were able to provide modeled water temperatures to pair with their detections of whitefish to include in that distribution modeling effort. And this is a relationship that is ongoing. Next, we received an outreach from Wisconsin DNR because they were going through a proposed rule change process for the smallmouth bass fishing season around Green Bay. As I understand it, rising temperatures were seemingly moving the spawning season of smallmouth bass such that it had increased overlap with the season in which they have a lot of fishing tournaments in the area, and that was presenting a potential risk to recruitment. So we used a under development deep hindcast model product shown here on the right to show what temperatures during that spawning season looked like in the vicinity of Green Bay, how much they'd warmed over time and what the trend looked like to kind of contribute to the process of looking at this proposed rule change. Now, in some cases, as capacity and expertise allow, we're also getting directly involved in research collaboration. With U Windsor, Michigan State, and Michigan DNR, we are working on launching a salmonine telemetry and distribution modeling effort where we will then pair that tagging data with NOAA models to better understand the distribution of habitats for these species through the Great Lakes, how they evolve seasonally, and how they might change in the future. We also received funding from the Craigenine Restoration Program to provide modeled estimates of past and future conditions in Saginaw Bay at Cisco restoration sites. So, as these restoration activities for Cisco are ongoing in Saginaw Bay, we wanted to look at how environmental conditions during the spawning and incubation periods have changed since Cisco were last abundant in this system and may change in the coming decades to provide that additional information and context for folks evaluating the success of the restoration activities. And finally, we're working with U.S. Fish and Wildlife to look at the potential drivers behind the spatial pattern in post-stocking Chinook survival shown here on the right in Lake Michigan. They're seeing this substantial spatial pattern in relative survival depending where Chinook are stocked. And so we're pulling different information out of some of our models of environmental conditions to see if any of these at least partially explain this pattern, such that then that could be used to think about, for example, future stocking strategies to maximize success. So in summary, there are many ways to include climate information in research and management, whether it's, explicitly including a climate indicator in a model or leveraging climate information from basic research projects implicitly to think about how fisheries regulations are developed. NOAA's observations and modeling in the Great Lakes can provide a lot of valuable environmental data for this purpose. And so the CEFI team is supporting climate-informed research and management activities throughout the Great Lakes however we can. We're here to try to get the information that NOAA produces to the folks that need it for these kinds of efforts. And so with that, I will encourage you all to reach out to the CEFI team with any questions, ideas, wanting advice, anything like that. My email's here at the bottom right. We would love to hear from you and see if any of our existing and available model products may be able to assist in your efforts. So with that, I thank you all, and I hope to hear from some of you in the future.